Welcome to Session 3 of the ELIW program. Hello, I am Mary Jane Reed with the Leader's Edge. I regret you missed our in-person session on resiliency, but in this webcast, I will do my best to bring you up to date on the key content that you missed. Our topic today is being resilient, a key to leadership success. Indeed, resiliency is not a luxury. It is a key for us to be effective leaders. This is, of course, the third module of our four-part program. And let's just take a moment to review where you've been and what we have remaining for us in the rest of the sessions. In our first session, we discussed your primary leadership style and what happens to our style when we are under stress. The intent of this is to help us be more self-aware of ourselves, as well as to adjust our communication style to others whose style is different. In session 2, we discussed how to lead change by being organizationally savvy and using a variety of influencing tactics. We also shared some tools to help you assess who your key stakeholders are when you have to sell a new idea or an initiative within your organization. Today, of course, we're discussing resiliency. And then finally, in session 4, we're going to put it all together and give you some tools to help position yourself in your career for future opportunities. Our objectives today are fairly straightforward. I want to take and talk about the relationship between resiliency and performance in your career, your job, and your personal life. Assess your own level of resiliency, and we're going to do that a couple times throughout this session. And of course, you did take an online resiliency assessment, which we'll also talk through. Also, we're going to suggest you develop a simple action plan to enhance your own resiliency, picking out one or two areas that you'd like to change and make a purposeful decision in doing so. And finally, we'll apply resiliency principles to leading groups and teams. It's not only important for you as a leader to be resilient, but you want to create the environment and encourage your own team members to be resilient as well. As your pre-work, as I mentioned earlier, we asked you to complete the resiliency map online and bring that with you to this session. Hopefully you have that in front of you. Also, we wanted you to read the introduction and overview to the book Prosilient, Building Your Resilience for a Turbulent World. I particularly like this book, and the word prosilience, of course, is a made-up name, meaning how do we become proactively resilient. So what is this thing we call resilience? Think about that for just a second. We're defining it in three general ways. The ability to recover quickly from setbacks. The ability to incorporate life experiences into new ways of thinking, feeling, and acting, growing from crisis, not just getting through it. And thirdly, thriving during ongoing stressful times. We clearly are living through stressful times. Not only your work, but the events that have surrounded us over the last several months. These are important ways for us to cope in the day-to-day so we can show up every day as strong leaders. There's been an increasing body of research demonstrating the link between resiliency and performance. Burnout was once primarily associated with medical professionals. Now it is tied to office jobs, where employees feel overworked, undervalued, and pressured to place their careers at the center of their lives and identities. Last year, Gallup found that about 2/3 of U.S. workers experienced burnout on the job, making them more likely to take sick days, feel less confident in their work, or look for other jobs. This can lead to a downward spiral in both individuals as well as organizations. And that is indeed why we discuss resiliency in this leadership program. Now, let's take a moment and introduce a knowledge check. These are important for you to get the CP credits you need. We will stop 3 times for these knowledge checks throughout the program. In this particular knowledge check, I'm going to read you the question. Why is the resiliency included in a leadership program? A, there's a strong link between performance and resilience. Being aware of our resilience is an effective way to combat professional burnout. Resiliency increases our productivity. D, none of the above. And E, all of the above. So please take a moment and answer this question. The answer to this question is obviously E, all of the above. So when we are faced with challenges in our lives, there are basically 3 strategies resilient people have found helpful in dealing and recovering from these challenges. And indeed, I'm talking about little challenges as well as very tough challenges, and we'll talk about what some of those tough challenges are. Many times, it's such that we have to accept reality and move on. This could be the case of losing a job or the death of a loved one. And that is what accept what is. Sometimes we can reframe the challenge. This involves learning from the situation and finding that proverbial silver lining in the dark cloud and find ways to leverage the good out of every situation. And finally, there is potentially the ability to change the situation. If we are unhappy in a relationship, we can decide to separate. This is also sometimes difficult, but it leads to the eventual change and reduces the stress of a non-productive relationship or job. So there is and by the way, resilient people use a combination of these 3 strategies, not just one. And let's talk about some challenges that many of you may have faced. One of these big challenges in life I call BHUC. Several years ago, Jim Collins wrote the best-selling business book, and he referred to a technique many companies use calling big, hairy, audacious goals, or BHAGs. Many of you may remember that. However, I also think that life gives us some big, hairy, ugly challenges, and that's why I came up with the name a BHUC. And recently, we have just gone through a very big BHUC called COVID-19. Where our lives were literally totally disruptive and turned upside down, and where we experienced anywhere from a 60 to 90-day shutdown, where we were working from home and dealing with the stresses of raising a family perhaps, doing our work, and probably the work had also changed dramatically during that time, as well as, and even if you were sheltering in place alone, the challenge of being alone and feeling isolated. This was indeed a big, hairy BHUC by any stretch of the name. Also, other BHUCs life gives us, as we talked about, the loss of a loved one, a need to change jobs, relocations. These are all BHUCs. And we need to think through how we approach them, because you can't get through life without experience at least a few. This is often a time I ask people to reflect on your own personal BHUCs, and I urge you to do so, even though we really can't do this in this format, but think through how you dealt with the early days, perhaps, of the COVID-19 shutdown. Or think through a time when life gave you a BHUC, What did you do? How did you feel? And what got you through it? So let's take an example, a few examples of people who have experienced some of life's biggest BHUCs. This slide with Malala is a story that I suspect we all know. She's a young woman who was shot by the Taliban for her stance on women, educating young women, and she almost perished as a result of that fatal gunshot wound to her brain. Thanks to nearby surgeons, she was able to recover. And indeed, she came back and even had a stronger voice for educating young women, as well as the publicity that incident created, she leveraged to advance the cause of educating women. So she not only accepted the change, that obviously she had a long recovery from the surgery, but she went back to make changes and to change the situation, used the situation to help advance her cause, and the cause for all young women. Another sad situation is a young woman a young girl who's named Alex Scott. Alex is no longer with us, but her family certainly is. Alex was diagnosed with leukemia at a young age and spent 2 or 3 years in the hospital through cancer treatment. Through all those painful and hard treatments, she said to her mom, "I want to have a lemonade stand." Her mother said, "Why?" She said, "Well, I want to be able to raise money so I can give that money to the doctors for more research for children's cancer, so other kids can find cures for kids like me." As it came to be, Alex never survived her cancer, but her family used her inspiration to create the Lemonade Fund in Alex's memory, and they have raised many millions of dollars over the years for the cause of childhood cancer. Now, obviously, they had to accept the reality of Alex's death, but again, they used that for a higher purpose and helped them with the healing process and creating a lasting memory for Alex. Another example is a woman I personally worked with many years ago, Geraldine Ritter. She is currently a senior VP and corporate secretary for Merck. And in May 2015, she was traveling back from a work engagement in Philadelphia to New Jersey when her Amtrak train derailed north of Philadelphia. They later found out that the derailment was caused by the train far exceeding the speed limits. If you look at the top of that slide, you will see that very crushed car, and that was the car that Geraldine was riding in. 8 people died in that crash, and many others were seriously injured, including Geraldine. She suffered major trauma to most of all her bodily systems, everything but her brain. She literally has gone over 24 surgical procedures, and they literally had to piece her body back together again. She admits that the hardest part of her 27 months recovery was just having the patience to grind through it. She mentioned to her the thing that got her through every day was wanting to make sure she was up and dressed when her 3 boys got home from school. She obviously used that time for reflection, and she believed that her support of her family was the thing that got her through. She had to accept the reality of her injuries. She could not wish them away. But today she is lecturing and speaking to small groups of other individuals who are survivors of tragic accidents and injuries to help them get through those difficult times and find, if you will, whatever silver linings they have found in their personal tragedy. So what we have learned from these three examples is that resilient people make conscious decisions. They feel grief, anger, and loss, but they don't let it become a permanent state. They use those emotions, rather, to consciously decide what they'll do to survive, cope, and make things turn out well. So they don't get swallowed up into a dark place. They feel the anger, they feel the grief, but they use that emotional energy, turn it around, and create a conscious decision to move forward. Now, at this next moment, I'd like to have another quick knowledge check. Which is not an effective strategy for dealing with a BHUC or a big, ugly challenge? A, accept what it is. B, deny and forget it ever happened. C, change the situation. Or D, reframe the challenge. So take a moment and indicate which answer you believe is correct. Remember, this is not an effective strategy. If you answered B, you are correct. B, you cannot deny when big challenges happen. Denial tends to bite us back, find its way forward, and create even more disruption and more stress to our systems. So it is important that we accept it, move on, and find which of the other strategies would be more effective. At this moment, I would like you to go and find handout 1 that was sent to you as part of the instructions for this webinar. Find, please, handout 1. It is entitled The Urgency Index. And I'd like you to stop the recording, this webinar, for a few moments while you complete the urgency index. In this index, you would indicate either 0 through 4 how true this statement is for you, or that most clearly represents your normal behaviors or attitudes. There are 16 questions, so take a moment right now, stop the webinar, and circle the answers that seem to be most relevant for you. Okay. I'm going to ask you to put this urgency index aside for a few minutes until a few moments down this webinar. Resiliency, though, is more than bouncing back from a BHUC, a big, hairy challenge. It is also adapting quickly to new circumstances as we find themselves in, thriving in constant change, being flexible, learning how to manage stress, and maintaining our confidence during those challenging times. Indeed, if you look at our work lives, I suspect we find we have lots of little BHUCs showing up in all of these pictures I'm showing you on the screen. Someone on the phone who upset you, more work than you can stand, not enough time in the day, the deadlines and reports. These are all little BHUCs that we have throughout the day, every day, as you are performing in your work and in your lives. And when these little BHUCs arrive, our bodies respond in what I call the fight or flight mode, or in more politically correct in our work life, probably silence or violence, hit back or keep quiet. But the same brain hormones that our prehistoric ancestors had, that is adrenaline and cortisol, so they could activate into fight or flight when they saw that saber-toothed tiger, are still around in our systems. And if we do not manage them, they can lead to long-term stress, which I'll talk about in just a moment, when we are either want to fight back or we want to shrink back. And going back to our first session, when we find ourselves in the red zone on our disc, we often will turn into think tanks, snipers, whiners, judges, and that's an indication that our stress levels are high and therefore our adrenaline and cortisol may be high. Under stress, our body, our brain works so fast that it shoots adrenaline and cortisol through all our crucial functions, which elevates our breathing and our heart rate. I'm sure many of you who've ever experienced maybe a near-miss accident in a car can recall the pace of your heart beating rapidly after that near miss. I pray it was a near miss for you all. This happens automatically. It is very hard for us to control. When our brain sees a threat, our brain immediately starts releasing adrenaline and cortisol. And what adrenaline and cortisol do, it impairs our thinking. It shuts down the non-urgent functions. And the non-urgent functions, in this case, are generally our brain, the prefrontal cortex, where our cognitive reasoning is, our intelligent thinking, our ability to analyze, be creative, and problem solving. So literally, as the brain rushes to our heart and lungs, it leaves the brain. And when it leaves the brain, we don't become as intelligent, so we do things we often later regret. I'm sure many of you have instances that you recall when you perhaps responded out of the heat of anger or rage and later wish you could have taken some of those words back. So this is something we need to be very aware of. It's a natural phenomena, but there are ways we can learn to manage that stress when it occurs. And by the way, if we don't manage that stress and the elevated adrenaline and cortisol, it can lead to long-term chronic illness, physical illness, more colds, flus, obviously higher healthcare costs, increased turnover, loss of productivity, and frankly, the ability to build positive relationships. So these are things this is why we study this, and this is why we're seeing so much more professional burnout occur in our organizations and companies, and this is why this is so important to think through. I'd like you now to take a look at that urgency index you completed a few minutes ago. See where you rated yourself. Did you have very many 3s and 4s? In fact, if you added the whole scores up, all your scores, the 2s, the 1s, the 4s, the 5s, and if your total score was 47 or higher, you may be suffering from something I call being an adrenaline junkie, that you love and your body has gotten used to those adrenaline rushes for meeting that last deadline and sliding into third base, or another metaphor if we want to use. But be careful with that and look at those particular situations that caused you to rate yourself 3 or 4. We're not going to dig into it right now, but what could you do to change your reaction and response to some of those situations? Many times it could be systemic within your organization, but sometimes it could be self-induced, and that's what we really want to get through today. So, when faced with that adrenaline rush, what do we do in the short term? The one thing I believe is to quickly rebalance and restore our nervous systems so we can stay and play. We want to get our nervous system back in balance. Technically, it's our sympathetic nervous system and our asymmetric sympathetic nervous system, but that's medical jargon you probably don't need. Be important, though, in the moment, when you feel that adrenaline rush, when you feel yourself turning into a tank, a sniper, or a whiner, is to breathe. I know that sounds so simple, but if we could take a deep breath, it goes a long way to move the blood back out from our hearts and lungs, back to the front of our brain and our prefrontal cortex. So deep breathing. I read an article just recently that said we, Americans particularly, have never learned how to breathe properly. We tend to breathe not through our nose, but through our mouth. And to breathe properly and to get the benefits of the oxygen into our bloodstream, the best thing to do is breathe through your nose and exhale through your mouth. I'm going to take a moment and just lead you through an exercise while you're watching this webinar. I'd like you to take a moment and take a deep breath so that you can literally feel your stomach move in. So take such a deep breath you can feel your stomach move inward. So take a deep breath, hold it for 1, 2, 3. And slowly let it out through your mouth. Do that again. Make sure you're breathing through your nose, holding it, and slowly releasing. Now, breathing is something you can do at any time. When you have been ambushed in a meeting, you have the ability to breathe deeply before you respond. And by breathing deeply, I think you'll find you will respond maybe more appropriately, more intelligently, and more self-aware than if you just responded. If possible, if you're at your desk and can take a stretch, get up, roll your shoulders, move your body. Throughout the day, I often recommend to people, especially if they've been sitting at their computers, to stretch at least every 30, 40 minutes. Do something, walk around. Get another cup of coffee or a glass of water. If you can, possibly take a walk. And frankly, one of the best remedies is laugh. If you can find something to laugh about or turn the situation around, laughter is such a good remedy for stress relief. I remember once visiting a IT center where this was a help desk for a large corporation, where all those people all customers would call in when they were having problems with their laptop PCs. And you can imagine most of the people calling in were pretty unhappy. And the IT specialists, who were the ones charged with helping them, shared with me that they often kept little clips of their favorite comedian nearby on their computer so they could switch over to them in a few moments when they had a break between calls and have a good laugh. Oftentimes we know that even if you've seen the situation or the scenario or the comedian once or twice, you still can laugh when he's a good comedian. So just some thoughts. You don't want to necessarily laugh at the person who ambushed you, but maybe you can find something in that situation to enjoy. Now let's talk about restoring for the longer term, or building or becoming prosilient, as Linda Hoops discusses in her book. And at this point, again, I'd like you to find handout 2. That is a handout that's entitled 10 Things I'd Like to Do. Again, I'd like you to pause this webinar and take a moment and fill out the 10 things you like to do. If you can't fill out all 10, at least try to come up with 5 or 6 of things that you like to do that are healing, renewing, enjoyable, things that help you relieve your stress. So take a few minutes now and fill out that form, and we'll debrief it when you come back. Welcome back. Now hold on to that form because we're going to talk about it in just a few moments. In her book, Linda Hoops discusses the importance of regularly restoring are four energy sources. They are physical energy, mental energy, emotional, and spiritual. And the resiliency map you took earlier is very much parallels these four sources. Often they come under the category of self-care. But let's delve into these four sources of energy more deeply now. Renewing our physical energy. This is clearly more than just having a good exercise routine, although that is still critical. Finding what you like to do for exercise. This exercise should not be a chore. Many people love to run. Others like yoga. Others perhaps just a good walk. Find what works for you and do it on a regular basis. Doing something you hate doing usually doesn't create good habits for us. We'll easily break them when the times are tough. Sleep. That's kind of critical. Indeed, more and more research has shown the importance of getting at least 7 hours of sleep a night. For those of you who have young children at home, I know that's quite an obstacle to overcome. But trying to find techniques and ways for you to get sleep. And it's one of those things that you could say, I'll sleep on the weekend, really doesn't work. You need to find ways to sleep during the week and during stressful times. Hydration, again, very critical. I know during the COVID shutdown, many of us resorted to our favorite beverages of wine and cocktails, but frankly, we have to remember good old-fashioned water. It's key to the balance of our systems and finding that amount of water that works for you in a healthy way. And, of course, eating right, eating the right foods for you. Again, what works for someone doesn't always work for you. Again, find those healthy eating routines that work, which usually minimize sugar and fats. My favorite foods, of course. But just keep that in mind. Be looking at that. This, again, falls often under your resiliency map as self-care. The other domain, though, is renewing our mental energy. This is key. Finding those things where we can pause and slow down, perhaps meditate. Shut down your screens, your big ones and your little ones. Get away, read a book, take a walk. Find those things that help you restore your mental energy. And this is all about slowing down, building habits of how you maybe start your day and how you end your day. One client I found that she had found a lot of joy, and the way she liked to start her day was going out she lived in a townhouse, but she had a little plot of grass in the back, and she loved putting her toes in the grass. That didn't work, of course, in the middle of winter, but that little enjoyment of putting her toes in the grass as she started reflecting on her day helped her frame of mind as she started her workday. Slowing down at night also helps us with our sleep. What are those habits we can create to help us get our mind rested before we attempt sleep? Emotional energy. This is critical. I think during the COVID-19 crisis and the shutdown, many of us had to find imaginative ways to renew our emotional energy. And that's, lo and behold, the Zoom happy hour materialized, which is great. The importance of having family, friends you can connect with is very critical to our emotional energy. Having pets, walking your dog. The one fun statistic I think that came out of our great shutdown was the number of dogs and pets. The adoption rate in animal shelters went through the roof, which of course is a good thing. because I believe people were instinctively needing ways to renew that emotional energy in themselves. Think about how you renew your emotional energy. And finally, renewing our spiritual energy. Many times people will find renewal through spiritual religious practice. Others may find it through giving, working in food banks. Again, going back to the great shutdown period and the COVID crisis, wasn't it refreshing to see the number of people that came out to cheer our healthcare workers and first responders? So spiritual energy is not, again, just religious practice, but it's also about giving back, finding that higher purpose in your life, find those outlets. Now, what I'd like you to do is look through that handout 2 that you completed, the 10 things I like to do. Look down those areas that you put down as restorative and think to yourself, did they help me with my physical energy, my emotional, my mental, or my spiritual? I urge you that if you didn't cover all 4 domains or 4 energy sources, you might think about adding a couple more to your list that you, of course, enjoy doing. But it may be good reflection for you to think, okay, what am I not doing that could be helpful and that I would enjoy doing to renew your physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual energies? Now, I'm going to pause for another moment for a knowledge check. You're sitting in a staff meeting and a coworker directs a snarky remark or comment to you that is totally undeserved. You feel yourself getting angry. What is the most effective technique you can use in the moment to restore your balance? Do nothing? Tell him he's being rude? Breathe deeply? Or say to yourself, I'm going to go for a long run after work? Take a moment to determine which is the best answer for restoring in the moment after being the recipient of a snarky mark. All right. If you've answered C, breathe deeply, you've answered correctly. I don't recommend telling someone he's rude at the moment. Doing nothing doesn't usually help, and that long run after work is good for you, but it may not help you during the course of the meeting. So answering C was the correct answer. Now, another concept that Linda Hoops provides in her book is the concept of our resiliency muscles. And you have a handout of these muscles. It's handout number 3. And you may just find it helpful to look at that handout as I'm going through this particular slide. In addition to renewing our 4 sources of energy, Linda Hoops describes the importance of regularly exercising our resiliency muscles. I love her model and feel that it's very helpful. First one is positivity. It's all about how we review a challenge and how we reduce our anxiety by focusing and believing that we will get through this and finding those silver linings. I'm not suggesting an overly optimistic outlook. That can get us in trouble, but a positive. I will learn from this. I will get through it. Rather than fire, the world's coming to an end. So maintaining that positive outlook is so important. That is also true as you work with your teams, maintaining that positivity as a leader. The next muscle she suggests we exercise often is confidence. That is our own belief in our ability to handle challenges that life throws at us. Even when we may be struggling, we can sometimes fake confidence. Stand tall, check your posture, smile. Interestingly, smiling fools our brain into thinking it fools our brain to dispel anxiety and increase our confidence and helps us move forward. Priorities. This muscle determines how effectively we use our energy. Do we step back and consider what we really need to invest our time and energy, or do we try to do everything all at one time and fritter away our resources or stay all over the map? Can we say no when appropriate and stick to a few key priorities? Are you limiting the number of priorities you work on every day, every week? If not, I urge you to think through that carefully. I know the company demands are tough, but really sitting back and saying, what are the 2, 3 things I really need to get done today? Creativity. This muscle helps us consider a range of options and practices out-of-box ideas and solutions. As I look back to the COVID-19 crisis, it was so encouraging to see so many people exercising their creative muscles. Everything from drive-by birthday parties to graduations, to small manufacturers making face masks, and to whiskey distillers turning their supplies of alcohol into hand sanitizers. And, every day when given a setback, how many times do you stop and say, what else could I do? How do I exercise my creative muscles? This is also a great technique for leading teams and engaging them in thinking creatively. Connection. People with this well-developed connection muscle are open to others and have a supportive, reciprocal network from which to draw upon. They readily reach out to others for support, advice, and assistance, and equally as important, people reach out to them. It's so important that we maintain our networks and connections with people, not just in our workplace, but outside of our workplace. We're going to be talking of the importance of networking, but connection is also the importance of reaching out to people when you have a problem where others can help you. Structure. Often, when our normal routines of work break down, as they did during the recent COVID crisis, it's important to plan, sort, and bring structure to our day and our week. To me, this is the most helpful. When I'm feeling overwhelmed with work, I tend to use a big piece of paper and literally map out with a marker, what is it I really need to do? And then I keep it in front of me, and I structure my day so that I hit all the priorities that I need to get done. Structure and priority setting are very similar. It's important we use them connected together. And creating new structures when old ones don't work anymore. That's equally as important, else they become rigid. And finally, experimentation. Use this time. Experimentation is when you're under stress, do we need to try different things? Many times, maybe you love running 3 or 4 times a week as part of your exercise routine. Well, what happens if you've had an injury? What do you need to do to be able to still renew your physical energy, but do it in a different way? The importance is experiment and find something else that you would find enjoyable. Depending on your injury, it might be something like yoga. It might be you could bike ride versus run. But find it, experiment. Look for other ways when faced with challenges. Look for other ways to experiment, try out new things, continue to learn. Now, it's also very important that we don't overuse these resiliency muscles. I alluded a few times earlier about this. Being positive could lead to unrealistic optimism. That is not healthy. Confidence can lead to arrogance. You're not listening. You're so confident what you're doing, you don't see the caution signs. or you're not listening to people trying to help you. Priority setting can lead to tunnel vision. I'm so focused on these 2 or 3 things, I may miss a most important new development that has come down the road. Creativity can create too many options, too many things. When you reach out to too many people in your network, you might get too much advice, which that leads not to action, but just pondering. Too much structure could lead to rigidity, and perhaps too much experimentation could lead to some taking dangerous risks. So these are muscles you want to use, but not overuse. Be thinking about them. How do you use these muscles? How have you used them recently? And how can you continue to use them going forward? Now, at this point, I'd like you, let me try to tie this all together because we've covered a lot of material here. And this is a little graph that I have created to try to not only take all the things that Linda Hoop says in her book, our energy resources, constantly renewing our battery, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. Exercising our muscles. By the way, these muscles are really ways of thinking, which you will also see show up on your resiliency map in a few minutes. So exercising our resiliency muscles so that we can build our resiliency reserves so that when BHUCs happen, big or small, we're able to bounce back and not be devastated by the new challenges. That is the point of being prosilient, having full resiliency reserves. And you'll see that also as we move on to your resiliency map. So at this time, I'd like you to pull out the resiliency map that you completed online, as well as the interpretation guide that went with it. Take a look at that map, and this is just a demonstration of your map is, of course, much longer and has very many categories to it. And I'm going to suggest that we cannot do in this webinar a deep dive into your resiliency map, but I'm going to give you enough for you to reflect on so that you can perhaps talk to your cohort facilitator if you have any questions regarding it. As you'll notice on your scoring on the grid that was given you, you have optimal, balance, strain, and burnout or caution. If you are optimal or balanced in many of these categories, congratulations, that's wonderful. It shows that you have good resiliency reserves. However, do look at the bottom part of the chart where you have areas of strain or caution burnout. And look at those areas that you can do something about. Pick one or at most 2 areas that you would like to strengthen your reserves or renew your reserves in those areas. I might point out, though, in part 1 and 2, if you look at items 1 through 6 on the left-hand side of your chart, these are often strains that you may be going through that you have little control over at the moment. Your organization could be going through some major transition, a merger, an acquisition, and you have not a lot of room that you can make an impact on. You need to be aware of the stress that's causing. But the things that you have control over are really starting from Section 7 down through 21, such things as self-esteem, positive outlook, purpose in life, self-care, situation mastery, time management, expression, empathizing, and so forth. Those are things that you can control. Look for areas that may be under strain or caution, and look through your map and see what items would you like to work on. In addition, I'd like you to go back to handouts 1 and 2. Do you see any congruence of this data Look back at your urgency map, your scores, those that you scored highs, 3s and 4s. Look at the 10 things you like to do. Are you finding some similarities? And as you look through some of these categories like positive outlook, situational mastery, these often also relate very closely to the resiliency muscles that Linda Hoops describes and that we just went through. So now what I'd like you to do is, again, pause, take a moment, and pick one area that you would like to work on over the next several weeks, identify it, and put it down on handout 4, which is your resiliency action plan. Take a moment and do that. Now, I know this requires time and reflection, and I urge you to continue that reflection long after this webinar is over. Go back to your resiliency map frequently. Go back to these handouts and see what changes you would like to make. But as of right now, pick one area and say you want to focus on that. Look for progress, not perfection. Make a small change. You'll be surprised what a small change can do to make a big result. And practice it for 21 days. This is why they call it the 21-Day Club. And you have access through your username and passcode to take this resiliency assessment again, perhaps in 3, 4, 5 months. You might want to see, is it working? Am I making progress? You have the option up to a year to retake this resiliency assessment. I'm going to give you an example of something so simple that a client did that made such a big change for her. And when I talk simple and small changes, this client had a very demanding job, a long commute, and when she came home, she struggled. She had some children, probably school-age children in the neighborhood of 7, 8, 10, and at the age where they want to talk about their day and you want to get connected with the family. And, of course, she was attempting to start dinner as well. But she found that she was not able to get that emotional energy because she still was looking at her phone, checking to see what emails came in, just was feeling distracted. And so she, as a result of doing this exercise, she made a conscious decision to put her phone, she walked past her laundry room when she came into the home, and instead of recharging it on the kitchen counter, she started recharging her phone in the laundry room. This way, she was not distracted when she got home and started engaging with her children and preparing dinner. And she did not go back to pick up her phone until closer to after the children were in bed. And she knew she was making results where at first she was kind of anxious, and at 9, maybe o'clock, she'd go back and look at her phone, see what messages came in. But she knew she was making a breakthrough when she realized she was leaving her phone plugged in overnight and was not looking at the phone until the next day. So she was not only re-energizing her emotional energy with her family, she was giving herself some, renewing her mental energy by cutting down on screen time and distractions. That was a small step she did that helped her significantly in increasing her resiliency. So I leave you with that story in mind. Finally, let's talk about how do you build resiliency on teams. Well, as a leader, it's very important for you to show up as the leader and the role model. But besides just being the role model and sharing the resources we talked about today, so many people I've talked to have loved the notion of the resiliency muscles and have shared that with their teams. They've also shared the book, Prosilient. Sharing and talking about resiliency on a team is a great gift a leader can make to their team. In addition, it's important that we as leaders communicate as much as we can about how the organization is doing. Sometimes you're in a situation where it would be a breach of confidence based on your position, but share what you can legitimately. Create a feedback-rich environment. Share with people. Have people give you feedback and be willingly to give each other feedback in a kind and caring way. Make a point of focusing on your team members and their development. What can you do as a leader to help them grow and develop on the job? What activities are you doing that you could delegate to them to help them grow? Most importantly, stamp out incivility as you find it. Don't let bullying occur in the workplace. Don't let uncivil remarks go unnoticed, and stamp them out. And of course, as I mentioned earlier on, be a role model. If you're not doing it, it is unlikely your team is going to catch up, because our actions, as we all know, speak louder than our words. And finally, the one area I want to emphasize is that when it comes to resiliency, there is no one prescription that works for everyone. It is as unique as your DNA. Even though you may have a colleague, a partner, a friend who gets great joy out of doing yoga, you may not, and you get joy and renewal from some other physical activity. Key is to find what works for you and continue to experiment until you find that groove. And if life hands you some challenges that you have to change, again, experiment and find ways to renew those 4 sources of energy we talked about. Lastly, I just want to remind you of your cohort assignment coming up. You in your class site, you have an article. Resilience is about how you recharge, not about how you endure. It very much continues the themes we talked about today. We'd also like you to read Chapter 8 in the book Prosilient, and that deals very much with the resiliency muscles we talked about. And refer to the quick reference guide you got for some of the discussion questions that you have about your calls. But be prepared in your cohort call to talk about any small changes you made or what area of your resiliency map that you want to enhance. So finally, that is the conclusion of our webinar. I wish I could have meet you in person, but I hope this was helpful to you. Please reach out to me, mjreed@theleadersedge.com, if you have any questions. And thank you.